Grid Layout Part 2. Now that we had a look at how we set up the grid, let's talk about explicitly placing items in different areas of the grid. It's important to know the parts of the grid as we move items around on the grid. We can use the lines between the columns and rows to indicate where the children will be placed. We can also place them in more than one cell or intersection of a column and row. We can place them in an area of the grid that spans multiple rows and or columns. Let's look at the HTML we created from a wireframe. We want to use the div with the class of HomeGrid to be the grid container or parent. It has 5 direct children: the video, an H1, an aside, and 2 icon images. Only these direct children can be placed in the grid, not the H2 or the P. They are grandchildren. They will go along with their parent, the aside, wherever it's placed in the grid. If we have set up the parent div with the class of HomeGrid with 3 equal columns and a grid gap of 40 pixels, the 5 children will automatically be placed in the order they were in HTML into the grid, with the first 3 in the first row and the remaining 2 children wrapping around to make a second row. You can see the grid by using the developer tools. Just rest your mouse pointer over the parent element. Notice that the aside is making the first row very tall because it has a lot of content. But if we want to make it look like our wireframe, how are we going to do that? I would place the rows and columns of the grid over my wireframe to see how that looks. Notice how the columns and rows are and how they have numbers between them. To place an item of the grid or one of the children, we can use the grid column start and the grid column end properties. The number value you give this property refers to the lines between the columns and rows, not the columns and rows themselves. For example, we want the path to the beach video and this title to go from column line 1 to column line 3, and from row line 1 to row line 2. If I want the first child to go across 2 columns, I will say what line number to start from and which line number to go to. So grid column start 1 and grid column end 3. It starts at line 1 and goes to line 3, spanning the first 2 columns. There's also a shortcut for this: grid column 1/3. The number before the slash is the start line, and the number after the slash is the end line. The same works with grid row to 1/2. Notice how the other children are still implicitly just going into the available cells. We need to place them as well. Let's place the path to the beach H1 title into the same place, since in our wireframe it's going over the top of the video. Wait, where did it go? The H1 comes after the video in our HTML. So the stacking order has to go behind the video. We can change that with Z index. Giving it a positive number like 1 would bring it forward. 0 is the default, and if you give it a negative number, it's going to go back. So with that positive number, it will bring it forward. So there it is. We will center it in a minute. Let's place the aside child where we want it. According to our wireframe, the grid outline will span 2 rows, but only take 1 column. The column will start on line 3 and end on line 4. So we put grid column 3/4 and grid row 1/3, spanning 2 rows. The last 2 items, the 2 icons, implicitly took the remaining spots, and it happens to be where we wanted them, so we don't have to explicitly place them. Now that we have them all placed, let's center the H1 title Path to the Beach. To center a child item of a grid vertically, because ours is already centered horizontally, so vertically we're going to use Align Self Center. We'll cover more about centering grid items later. All right, it looks great, and trust me, as difficult as that seemed, it is way easier than trying to use floats and positioning.